Hollywood once sold perfection, faces carved from light, hair that never moved, eyes that defined decades. But time rewrites every legend, quietly, unapologetically. Tonight is not about scandal or shame. It is about memory, endurance, and what remains when applause fades. These transformations are not losses. They are chapters, and some chapters feel heavier than we expect with age alone. If you are watching right now, take a quiet moment to tell us where you are and what time it is there. Al Pacino. In the 1970s and 1980s, Al Pacino became cinema royalty through The Godfather and Scarface. Fiery eyes, volcanic intensity, and commanding presence defined his peak. Now at 86, his frame has softened, hair silvered, energy quieter. Wisdom replaced menace. Greatness evolves, but authority never disappears. Richard Dean Anderson. Once the ultimate television hero, Richard Dean Anderson defined the late 1980s and 1990s as MacGyver. Rugged looks, easy humor, and quiet intelligence shaped his appeal. Now at 76, his hair is grey, frame softer, pace slower. Warmth endures. True heroism ages gently. Brad Pitt. In the 1990s, Brad Pitt defined modern masculinity through Legends of the Fall and Fight Club. Chiseled features, golden hair, and cool detachment marked his rise. Now at 62, silver strands and softer lines emerge. Magnetism matures. Calm replaces flash. Bill Pullman. Once the approachable leading man of the 1990s, Bill Pullman charmed audiences in While You Were Sleeping and Independence Day. Warm eyes and calm authority shaped his appeal. Now at 73, features soften and movements slow. Familiarity endures. Comfort becomes his legacy. Leonardo DiCaprio. Once Hollywood's golden boy of the 1990s and 2000s, Leonardo DiCaprio captivated audiences in Titanic and The Great Gatsby. Intense eyes and youthful magnetism defined his peak. Now at 52, features fuller, posture heavier. Depth replaces youth. Experience reshapes allure. Mark Harmon. In the 1980s and early 2000s, Mark Harmon became television's steady authority through St. Elsewhere and NCIS. Clean-cut looks and quiet strength anchored his image. Now at 75, silver hair and softened features accompany a private life. Consistency builds legacy. Silence can honor success. Tom Cruise. Once the fearless symbol of 1980s and 1990s cinema, Tom Cruise soared through Top Gun and Mission Impossible. Boyish grin, relentless energy, and physical commitment defined his peak. Now at 64, fine lines appear, intensity focused. Defiance of time remains. Drive fuels longevity. Richard Chamberlain. Once the ultimate television heartthrob, Richard Chamberlain ruled the 1960s through the 1980s with Dr. Kildare and the Thornbirds. Refined beauty, gentle eyes, and classical poise defined his era. He passed away in 2025 at 91, following complications from a stroke. Grace lingered. His legacy remained quietly luminous. Robert De Niro. In the 1970s through the 1990s, Robert De Niro defined cinematic intensity with Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and Goodfellas. Piercing eyes, disciplined method acting, and controlled power marked his peak. Now at 83, his movements are slower, features fuller. Authority remains. Depth replaces volatility. F. Murray Abraham. Once a commanding theatrical force, F. Murray Abraham rose to prominence in the 1980s through Amadeus. His authoritative voice, intense gaze, and classical discipline defined his peak. Now at 87, hair silvered, posture calmer, gravitas deepens with age, respect follows mastery. Johnny Depp. In the 1990s and 2000s, Johnny Depp captivated audiences through Edward Scissorhands and Pirates of the Caribbean. Dark eyes, eccentric charm, and unpredictable magnetism fueled his rise. Now at 62, grey streaks and weathered lines appear. Mystery survives. Individuality refuses to fade. Robert Wagner. In the 1950s through the 1970s, Robert Wagner embodied classic Hollywood charm through film and heart-to-heart. Smooth elegance and romantic appeal marked his era. Now at 96, pace slower, demeanor gentle. Grace matures quietly. Legacy remains polished. George Clooney. In the 1990s and early 2000s, George Clooney became a symbol of modern elegance through ER and Ocean's 11. Salt and pepper charm, relaxed confidence, and effortless wit defined his peak. Now at 65, laugh lines deepen, hair grayer. Sophistication matures. Presence grows calmer, stronger. William Daniels. In the late 20th century, William Daniels became a symbol of authority through St. Elsewhere and Boy Meets World. Calm voice and moral steadiness defined him. Now at 99, movements gentle, presence quiet. Wisdom lingers. Teaching outlasts performance. Harrison Ford. Once the ultimate adventure hero, Harrison Ford reshaped cinema from the late 1970s onward with Star Wars and Indiana Jones. Rugged charm and grounded toughness defined him. Now at 83, silver hair and lined features appear. Resilience becomes the story. Legends adapt, not vanish. Richard Roundtree. In the early 1970s, Richard Roundtree broke barriers as Shaft, redefining action stardom. Cool confidence and commanding presence shaped history. He passed away in 2023 at 81 from cancer-related complications. His influence endures. Representation reshaped cinema. Denzel Washington. Once the gold standard of authority, Denzel Washington rose from the late 1980s with Glory, Malcolm X, and Training Day. Commanding posture, piercing eyes, and moral gravity shaped his image. Now at 72, silver hair and calmer energy define him. Power matures. Dignity endures. Alan Alda. Once the voice of warmth and wit, Alan Alda defined the 1970s through MASH. Thoughtful humor and humane intelligence set him apart. Now at 90, living with Parkinson's disease. Movements slower. Purpose remains strong. Communication becomes legacy. Sylvester Stallone. Once the ultimate action hero, Sylvester Stallone dominated the late 1970s and 1980s with Rocky and Rambo. A sculpted physique and relentless drive symbolized strength. Now at 80, his body shows time, movements measured, presence calmer. Power no longer shouts. It endures, disciplined and earned. Sam Elliott. Once the embodiment of American masculinity, Sam Elliott rose from the late 1970s onward through Mask and Roadhouse. His deep voice, iconic moustache, and Western calm defined him. Now at 82, hair silvered, face weathered, pace measured. Presence endures, identity never wavers. Michael Douglas. Once the symbol of power in 1980s Hollywood, Michael Douglas dominated with Wall Street and Fatal Attraction. His sharp grin, confident voice, and polished danger defined success. Now at 82, silver hair and seasoned features replace edge. Authority remains. Experience gives it weight instead of shine. Dennis Quaid. In the 1980s and 1990s, Dennis Quaid balanced energy and charm through The Right Stuff and The Parent Trap. Boyish grin and athletic presence defined his rise. Now at 72, hair silvered, frame leaner. Vitality adapts. Spirit never fully quiets. Tom Hanks. Once the everyman of Hollywood, Tom Hanks rose in the 1980s and 1990s through Forrest Gump and Cast Away. Gentle eyes, sincerity, and emotional honesty defined him. Now at 70, grey hair and softer features reflect time. Kindness ages beautifully. Integrity never fades. Kurt Russell. Once the cool anti-hero of the late 1970s and 1980s, Kurt Russell defined toughness in Escape from New York and Big Trouble in Little China. Rugged confidence and effortless swagger shaped his image. Now at 75, silver hair and weathered lines appear. Ease replaces edge. Charisma stays constant. Jack Nicholson. In the 1970s and 1980s, Jack Nicholson electrified cinema with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and The Shining. A devilish grin and explosive energy defined him. Now at 89, living privately, movements slower. Myth survives retreat. Impact remains permanent. Steve Martin. In the late 1970s and 1980s, Steve Martin reshaped comedy through The Jerk and Planes, Trains and Automobiles. Sharp wit and intellectual humor defined him. Now at 81, hair silver, voice calm. Humor evolves. Intelligence carries laughter forward. Mel Gibson. In the late 1980s and 1990s, Mel Gibson redefined masculinity through Lethal Weapon and Braveheart. Piercing blue eyes, fearless intensity, and warrior energy carried his image. Now at 70, a silver beard, weathered skin, and slower rhythm mark time. The fire remains. Charisma survives every season. Sam Neill. In the late 1980s and 1990s, Sam Neill gained global recognition through Dead Calm, Jurassic Park, and The Piano. Intelligent calm and understated strength shaped his appeal. Now at 79, slimmer frame, grey hair, and quieter energy appear. Resilience defines beauty. Survival carries grace. Bruce Willis. Once the ultimate everyman action hero, Bruce Willis defined the late 1980s and 1990s with Die Hard. Witty toughness and grounded masculinity fueled his fame. Now at 71, retired due to frontotemporal dementia, his presence is quieter. Legacy speaks louder. Courage reshapes remembrance. Michael J. Fox. Once the ultimate symbol of youthful optimism, Michael J. Fox ruled the 1980s with Back to the Future and Family Ties. Fast speech, bright eyes, and restless energy defined his peak. Now at 65, movements are slower, expressions softer due to Parkinson's disease. Courage reshapes legacy. Inspiration outlives speed. Pierce Brosnan. Once the embodiment of refined charm, Pierce Brosnan defined the 1990s as James Bond. Perfect suits, piercing eyes, and effortless sophistication marked his peak. Now at 73, his hair is white, face softened, posture relaxed. Elegance matures. It never disappears. William Shatner. Once the bold face of science fiction, William Shatner defined the 1960s as Captain Kirk in Star Trek. Distinctive delivery and fearless confidence shaped his image. Now at 95, hair white, energy resilient, curiosity survives age, icon status endures. Robert Redford. In the late 1960s and 1970s, Robert Redford embodied classic Hollywood stardom through Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting. Golden hair, effortless charm, and quiet confidence defined him. Now at 90, retired, his features gentle, presence calm. Timelessness is not loud, it endures. Ian McKellen. Once a towering force of stage and screen, Ian McKellen reached global fame in the 2000s through The Lord of the Rings and X-Men. Commanding voice and expressive presence defined him. Now at 87, living with illness. Strength persists. Art sustains purpose. Hugh Grant. In the 1990s, Hugh Grant became the face of romantic comedy through 4 Weddings and a Funeral and Love, Actually. Boyish charm, floppy hair, and self-aware humor carried his image. Now at 66, hair thinned, wit sharper, tone drier. Charm evolves. Timing replaces innocence. Richard Gere. Once the ultimate romantic leading man, Richard Gere embodied quiet seduction in the 1980s and 1990s through An Officer and a Gentleman and Pretty Woman. His calm eyes, silver-tongued elegance, and effortless class defined an era. Now at 77, his hair is white, features softened, presence gentler. Grace does not age, it settles. Kevin Costner. Once the embodiment of American masculinity, Kevin Costner dominated the late 1980s and 1990s with Dances with Wolves and The Bodyguard. Calm authority, rugged restraint, and quiet confidence defined his peak. Now at 71, silver hair and seasoned features appear. Strength softens. Integrity remains unmistakable. Willem Dafoe. In the late 1980s and 1990s, Willem Dafoe stood apart through Platoon and later Spider-Man. Sharp features, intense eyes, and fearless transformation defined his presence. Now at 71, his frame is leaner, face deeply lined. Time sharpens character. Boldness never recedes. Nick Nolte. Once the ultimate rugged heartthrob, Nick Nolte defined the 1970s and 1980s through Rich Man, Poor Man, North Dallas 40, and 48 Hours. His wild blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and raw masculinity felt untamed. Now at 85, His hair is silver, features weathered, movements slower. Charisma does not vanish, it deepens. Christopher Walken. In the late 1970s and 1980s, Christopher Walken stood apart through the Deer Hunter and bold character roles. Unusual cadence and hypnotic intensity defined him. Now at 83, hair white, frame slender. Individuality endures. Style transcends time. Anthony Hopkins. Once the master of controlled menace, Anthony Hopkins redefined intensity in the late 20th century through The Silence of the Lambs. Piercing eyes and intellectual restraint marked his peak. Now at 89, hair white, features softened. Creativity continues. Discipline shapes longevity. Robert Duvall. Once the quiet force of American cinema, Robert Duvall defined the 1970s with The Godfather and Apocalypse Now. Subtle authority and emotional truth shaped his power. Now at 95, his presence gentler, pace slower. Craft matures. Respect deepens with time. John Travolta. In the late 1970s and 1980s, John Travolta electrified cinema with Grease and Saturday Night Fever. Effortless swagger, smooth movement, and radiant confidence made him iconic. Now at 72, his pace is slower, hair silvered, presence steadier. Confidence never ages. It simply changes rhythm. Warren Beatty. Once the magnetic rebel of late 1960s and 1970s cinema, Warren Beatty captivated audiences in Bonnie and Clyde and Shampoo. Striking looks and intellectual confidence fueled his fame. Now at 89, living quietly, movements slower, image softened. Influence fades slowly. Impact remains long. Dick Van Dyke. Once the embodiment of joy and motion, Dick Van Dyke defined the 1960s through The Dick Van Dyke Show and Mary Poppins. Expressive movement and boundless charm made him timeless. Now at 101, movements gentle, voice softer. Spirit outlasts motion. Joy refuses to age. Michael Caine. In the 1960s through the 2000s, Michael Caine became a global icon through Alfie, The Italian Job, and the Dark Knight trilogy. Cockney charm and effortless sophistication defined him. Now at 93, retired with limited mobility. Presence remains legendary. Influence speaks softly. Dustin Hoffman. In the late 1960s through the 1980s, Dustin Hoffman reshaped stardom with The Graduate and Rain Man. Nervous charm, sharp intelligence, and emotional honesty set him apart. Now at 89, his movements are slower, voice warmer, expressions gentler. Charisma outlives youth. It grows quieter, not weaker. Jon Voight. In the late 1960s through the 1970s, Jon Voight rose with Midnight Cowboy and Coming Home. Intense eyes and emotional vulnerability defined his peak. Now at 88, white hair and weathered features reflect time. Respect replaces spotlight. Craft carries memory forward. Val Kilmer. Once the ultimate heartthrob of the 1980s and 1990s, Val Kilmer shined in Top Gun and The Doors. Striking beauty and intense confidence defined his peak. He passed away in 2025 at 65 from pneumonia complications after throat cancer. Legacy outlives appearance. Memory remains powerful. Clint Eastwood. In the 1960s and 1970s, Clint Eastwood forged cinematic toughness through the good, the bad, and the ugly, and Dirty Harry. Steely silence and controlled menace defined him. Now at 96, mobility is limited, appearance is rare, influence remains vast. Legends linger without noise. Time reshapes faces, but it never erases meaning. These men carried eras on their shoulders, then carried age with quiet dignity. What remains is not youth, but presence. Not perfection, but memory. Hollywood moves on. True legends stay, living on in every role remembered.